Hello everybody, this is GM Jesse Kraai, and many players dislike facing a child prodigy. The board is pushed in the creature's direction so it can reach the pieces. It rides on a cushion the size of a small country, and parents maneuver a steady holding pattern with a worn bag of very crunchy chips. But chess is beautiful because we have prodigies. Like music and math, chess has a simplicity to it that can be grasped by a fertile young mind. In other disciplines of the mind, its practitioners are forced to habituate themselves to an ever-changing mosaic of arcane rules and senseless trivia. And that takes time. Also, in our game, all the child has to do is win, whereas in other fields, he needs some older person to validate his successes. Now, along with Ray Robeson, I consider Mr. Naroditsky the main new hope of American chess. Mr. Robeson already has 3 very strong games up here at Chess Lecture, 2 against I.M. Vigorito and 1 against G.M. Perelstein. Now, the following game was Mr. Naroditsky's first game since winning the World Under-12 Championship, and I chose it as I felt it demonstrates what I think natural chess talent is. A strong, intuitive grasp of the relationship between material, time, and quality of position. For example, there are many young players who can calculate extremely well, but most of those young minds don't even see variations where material is given up with no clear prospect of regaining it. Okay, so with that said, let's take a look at this position. I was white. Naroditsky was black. This first round of the North American Open recently in Vegas. And I played my new old man trick against the King's Indian here with D takes E. Now, my other lecture, the old man versus the King's Indian, I believe part 2, Eugenia Knight, FM, played knight takes E5 here. And I think, to Naroditsky's credit, he didn't think long and played D takes E, and which is the more consequent move. And basically, what black is trying to do is prove that I've made a mistake by taking on E5, because now black has prospects of landing on D4, whereas if my knight ever lands on D5, he still has a pawn on C7, which could conceivably knock it away. I played bishop G5. And now Naroditsky makes his first mistake, which I think is more psychological than anything else. King's Indian players in general don't want to go into an endgame, and that's one of the reasons that I think this system has worked so well. Not that it's really particularly strong, but just that it's leading to a kind of position that the King's Indian player doesn't want to face. And black's best move here is to play probably queen takes, rook takes, and something like bishop G4, where really he's aiming to fight for that D4 square, which I can't control with a pawn. So, as it was, he played queen E8. And to my mind, this is kind of reminiscent of the Tal Botvinnik match, where Botvinnik would threaten the trade of queens, and in order to get out of that trade of queens, Tal often compromised his position instead of trading. So this gives me a very easy game. I played now knight D5, and due to the threat on C7, F6, black has to take. And now I've greatly improved my pawn structure. Knight D4. But let's talk about it. So I think, to Naroditsky's mind, though, he's basing his plan with queen E8 on the fact that the knight on D4 is strong. And if I ever take the knight, I will expand both the scope of the queen on E8 and the bishop on G7. So my first move was just simple, rook C1. And here I think it's fair to say we can stop and say that the opening has gone very well for white. I'm better developed, my pawn structure is fine, and black's one trump of the knight on D4 isn't such a big deal. Naroditsky makes, I think, the best move, C6. So he's basically willing to take on pawn weaknesses for the sake of getting activity. And here, I did a kind of interesting psychological thing. To my mind, there were 2 really, there was really only one way that the game was going to go, and that was for me to take on d4, takes back, d takes, b takes. And I was concerned that, although I felt I was better here, that I had given his bishop on g7 a lot more scope, and the pawn on d4 is potentially going to give black some counterplay. So, for example, this variation could continue something like queen c2. Now black has to play actively. I think his best plan is to play h6, bishop d2, and f5, which is kind of instructive, where black is saying more than anything else he wants to free the bishop on c8. And once that's freed, then he'll have prospects of pushing d3. Okay. Interestingly, actually, after f5, I think white's best move is to play e5, after which he has a small advantage. He'll take my e5 pawn, I'll win the c6 pawn, and white will have an advantage due to the open black king, but definitely a position that black can play. So what I did is I took first on c6. And to my mind, I thought that if he took back with a knight, he got rid of his main trump, whereas if he took back b takes c, then we just get the position we were just talking about. As it turns out, however, I think I had a much stronger alternative here. I didn't even consider this during the game, and that was just to have played knight takes, pawn takes, and queen d2, really concentrating on my development advantage. So if queen takes c4, I have bishop f3, white's got a great position. But I didn't consider that during the game. Okay, so I played pawn takes pawn, c6, pawn takes pawn, knight takes, and now bishop b5. But here, Naroditsky shows some interesting talent here. First of all, I have to play bishop e5 because if I don't do something with the knight, then my rook on c1 isn't as active as it looks. It'll just be blocked. So he plays a nice move, queen e6, breaking the pin and attacking my pawn on a2. Also, his knight is now free again. So I have to take it. And so I see here what he's kind of thinking. He's saying, well, yes, I have a bad pawn on c6, but I have the two bishops, and hopefully in the future that can play a role. So I played the natural move, queen a4, protecting a2 and attacking c6. And he played bishop b7. And I was very confident in my position here, and I made an instructive mistake. And part of this mistake, I think, relates to my not appreciating Naroditsky's strengths going into this. I played the natural move, rook fd1, which we'll see is a mistake because Naroditsky really now shows some class and plays the move that I chose this game for, and that is c5, where he really just coughs the pawn completely. In a very beautiful way, because it's not clear that there's many ways I can approach this pawn sacrifice, and in a lot of them he doesn't get the pawn back. But what c5 does is it says I have to free the scope of the bishop on b7 at all costs. I can't leave it stuck in a passive position. If he just sits there, I'll gradually improve the position with moves like bishop e3, maybe bishop c5, and he'll have a completely passive position very soon. So c5 just chucks the pawn and is banking on the fact that that bishop on b7 will be very strong, which it now is. Now, when I take back, he plays rook ac8, and it's not clear, see, that my rook on d1 really even wants to be there. Okay, so let me just go back and show you a really strong move, Karpovian move, that I could have played here instead of the natural and arrogant rook fd1. Much stronger would have been to anticipate this and play h3. I want to play h3 not only for the back rank weakness, but to prevent queen g4. But notice you have to realize, in order to understand h3, that black has to really chuck the pawn with c5. And my head wasn't there yet. So, for example, now if c5, rook takes rook ac8, now I just have a very nice move, rook fc1. And I'm really controlling everything. Okay. So, as it was, I played rook fd1, and after c5, black has gone from a bad position to now a position with counterplay. Rook c5 was played. Now, rook a c8. Strong move. Notice that, again, the a7 pawn is just kind of flapping in the wind. But more important than the a7 pawn is the activity of the pieces. So here I looked at a number of things, and I have to be careful here. For example, let's say bishop e3, then queen g4 is strong. And notice, yes, I can grab another pawn, but think about it. I've just opened up now the scope of his other bishop on g7. And whilst queen e4, queen takes e4 might draw, I think queen e2 is a really good elucidation of what black's trying to do in opening up the activity of his pieces, whereas all of my pieces are completely floating about: the e4 pawn, the knight on e5, the rook on c5, the rook on d1, right? And I have a back rank weakness. So I basically took the minimalist solution here, which is probably the right decision. I took and played h3. Okay. So, bishop c6, strong move. So the point is, if I really can't simply move the queen away and hold the e-pawn. If, for example, queen c2, Naroditsky has queen a2. So, and if I take the pawn on a7, he correctly understands that after bishop e4, he'll be down a pawn, but his kingside majority would be very strong, and his bishops really have the potential to open up and to become factors in the game. So I had to do, again, the minimalist solution, queen a6. So I'm saying, yes, you can now win my pawn, but I will trade queens and damage the structure. However, I think this is a playable endgame for black. Naroditsky plays h6, a little bit debatable, but bishop e3, bishop e4, queen takes e6, pawn takes. Now I play rook d7. He correctly plays rook c2. And now this is a very difficult position to play correctly for white. White really has to be concerned about the bishops gaining counterplay. Yes, it's true that white has the advantage, but one of the interesting defensive mechanisms of being active is that your pieces really can come alive, and even if you don't win, create a combination that's going to win, you can often disrupt your opponent so much with your activity that he can't win even when he's up material. For example, let me show a variation here. If, say, bishop takes pawn, we can have a variation like this. Bishop d5, let's say a3, rook c2, rook d2, rook c1, king h2, e4, knight d4, bishop e5, g3 is forced, e3. And it's a very good illustration of how, despite the material advantage of white, the bishops really came alive, and now white is lost. So, difficult position for white. There's a lot of things he has to be worried about all of a sudden. So I played rook d7, rook c2, and here's where I make, I guess, my second mistake of the game. This one was a hard one to see, though. I played b4, trying to get a little cute, really, but I think the best way to play this position would have been like this. Rook takes a7, rook takes b2, knight d2, bishop d5, a4 is forced, and the point is that black can't stop me from playing f3. This is kind of a difficult tactical thing to see. First of all, he can't check me on b1, and if e4, I would have had this nice trick, rook takes g7, king takes, bishop d4, winning the game. So, that was something, though, that trick is something I didn't see, and to my mind, if he got e4 in without any problem, not only would his bishop on g7 be very active, but my knight is in danger of just becoming completely dominated. Okay. So I played b4, rook takes a2, rook takes a7. Bishop takes a7 might be a little bit better, but as far as I can tell, black should be able to now hold this position. Rook b2, bishop c5. And now Naroditsky makes a final mistake, which is, I think, indicative of endgame skills. Now, we saw at the beginning of the game that he didn't really want to go into the endgame. And a lot of times when I see that, it's not just that they have a preference for middle game positions, but they recognize that their endgame strengths aren't as strong. For example, the tall example is emblematic of such a thing. In this position, I feel that black should be able to draw after bishop d5. For example, if I play knight h4, he can just come back, and I can't do anything special with my pieces here. And the problem is that if I do some kind of building move, I don't know, rook c7 so I can threaten rook c8 or something, e4 is going to come. And notice on e4, I don't even have this trick anymore. Say rook takes, king takes, bishop d4, king f7, bishop b2, ef, and we have a draw. So not even that works. So what we're going to see, though, is Naroditsky thought to himself, if I can manage to win the b-pawn by force in this position, then it should be a draw, but that was a mistaken assumption. Let's look at why. g5, so what is g5 doing? g5 is preventing knight h4. Now, bishop d6 is my only chance, and I think he thought with bishop f8 he might be able to draw. But now I simply have bishop takes. Now, first of all, if bishop takes knight here, I can play bishop takes, say bishop d5, rook g7, king h8, rook g5, rook b4, rook e5 with a winning endgame. So that's not going to work, but I think really when he played g5, he had already seen in his mind the following endgame here, which was king takes, knight takes e5, rook takes b4, where many players think that this is going to be drawn just because it looks so simple. But knight f7 shows a lot of black's issues here. The knight is a local piece as opposed to the bishop, because the bishop can only control one color, whereas with local weaknesses like black has here, the knight is going to be the dominant piece, and here black is losing a pawn. I thought in the game his best chance would be something like this: king g7, knight g5, king f6, knight takes, knight f7 is possible too, but this position, it's close. Let's just say it's very close to a win for white. I'm not going to go as far to say that it's necessarily winning. It's very close. So he played rook b7, I think believing that this was going to be a draw. But the knight is a local piece, like I said, and with the extra pawn plus black's pawn weaknesses, black's not going to be able to save this. King g7, knight g4, king g6, f3, king f5, king f2, bishop a6, knight e3, king f4, knight d1, reorganizing, bishop e7, knight c3, bishop c6, knight e2, king e5, king e3. And now basically we can see white's plan. I want to push black back, and in particular I want to trade the f pawn for the g pawn. Once I do that, I'll have two passed pawns, the h and g, and black's own pawn on e6 won't be all that meaningful. Okay, so we have bishop b5, knight g3, bishop a6, knight e4, king f5, g4, king g6, f4, pawn takes, king takes, bishop f1, h4, bishop e2, check. Just a little trick, because after king h6 I have g5. Now if king takes h5 I have knight g3, king g7, knight f6, bishop d1, knight g4, bishop e2, g6, and after e5, king g5, black resigned because I'm going to have the threats of h6, knight f6, and g7 can't be stopped, and of course the king and pawn endgame is won. So I thought this was a very good game by a young player, and in particular I think it shows that with the study of his own games he's going to be able to make huge progress. In particular, what we saw here is more a fear of the endgame than anything else, as far as I could see, that limited his progress in this game. The bigger thing, which is harder to learn, this relationship of scope of your own pieces, the activity of your own pieces versus material, is something he clearly understood in a very deep way. So I'm looking forward to covering more of his games. This is GM Jesse Kraai, hoping you enjoyed the lecture. Bye-bye.